Greetings, Resident Evil fanatics. It's getting dark out here. As the rain continues to fall and new evils dance around us, our only hope is to expand our knowledge of those evils. I hope you don't mind this certain someone walking beside us. They'll be joining us today as we continue our study of the dark and the sinister. We've spent the last 2 episodes exploring classical Oni folklore in the context of Onimusha, but tonight, we must return to something long overdue. It is time to explore the next Resident Evil novel by S.T.A.R.S. In 2 previous episodes, we examined the novelizations of RE0 and RE1 in great detail. Resident Evil 0 Hour uncovers a much more intimate and bothersome relationship between Marcus and his beloved leech children. It also fleshes out the diverging motives of Wesker and Birkin and offers a more palpable chemistry between our heroes, Billy and Rebecca. Resident Evil, The Umbrella Conspiracy, offers a much greater depth of characterization than the first game ever came close to, even adding exclusive scenes to strengthen the rapport among the S.T.A.R.S members. It, along with Resident Evil the book, adds extended backstories with supporting characters for Chris and Jill. Both books build on the seemingly untouchable aura of the Umbrella Corporation. Umbrella practically holds a leash on Chief Irons and his men. Keep this theme of Umbrella's omnipotence in mind, as tonight's analysis will take it even further. Tonight, we will be examining the first of 2 original narratives in S.T.A.R.S. series of 7, Resident Evil, Caliban Cove. This adventure takes place in between RE1 and RE2. Given that Resident Evil, the book, is only 7 chapters long and shares much of its added lore with the Umbrella Conspiracy, Caliban Cove was the first original RE novel of this magnitude, being a similar length to Perry's other full-length novel adaptations. As ambitious as that sounds, I'm pleased to say that while Caliban Cove relies heavily on newly introduced characters and plotlines, it is indeed a Resident Evil story from cover to cover. It respects all the essential ingredients of any RE narrative. And this archetypal RE formula is something we'll deconstruct tonight. Let us begin. Brace yourself, as this one's going to get violent. About why you're here tonight. This is Resident Evil storytelling we're talking about, an aspect of the franchise all too often dismissed as vapid and unmoving. It's not at all uncommon to find fans and outsiders alike that claim, why focus on the lore? Why take interest in such a ridiculous story as Resident Evil? Resident Evil was never known for its story. Yet, despite all of its criticisms, not a single horror game franchise can rival the immortality of the Resident Evil characters and storylines. The heroes, villains, and their tales never fail to spark an overwhelming surge of adoration from fandoms, artists, content creators, and outsiders of the franchise, even in response to the more divisive entries. For every RE veteran that despises one of the sequels, a newcomer, or several, takes great interest in that entry, and they cherish it as their first blood with the franchise. But regardless of one's affinity for certain entries of the series over others, be it more action or more horror-focused, Resident Evil's true allure comes from something more calculated. Its success isn't necessarily due to unblemished writing or immaculately detailed character designs, but due to a loosely balanced fusion of key ingredients. While similar ingredients are undeniably present in so many other horror titles, Resident Evil administers them in such a peculiar, almost theatrical rhythm. The RE formula is an amalgam of madness, tension, and absurdity that no other franchise could hope to truly replicate. And it is always willing to be mad and to be absurd one more time. Its sequels and remakes are indicative of just how much value it places on tradition and reinstating those trademarks of its early successes. Resident Evil is masterful at capitalizing off of familiarity. Despite how much it allegedly evolved over time, its core formula has done no such thing. Resident Evil doesn't mind feeding off of its own cliches and stereotypes and even pats itself on the back for reintroducing them. It doesn't fret about its own predictability, it simply embraces it. In a way, it's almost reminiscent of the Fast and the Furious movies. These films are perfectly aware of the repetitive, inane nature, but always deliver that familiar, over-the-top experience that their fans so ravenously crave and even expect. I don't even have to watch Fast 9 to enumerate almost every core element that comprises the film. This franchise ultimately delivers a similar blend of long-cherished heroes, flashy street racing, comically excessive action sequences, and stock villains in nearly every installment. Similarly, Resident Evil aims to re-establish its defining strengths with slight distortions in each entry, and this is mostly in regards to the narrative. While not as predictable or senseless with its writing as the Fast and the Furious, Resident Evil still recycles its own tropes, essentially spoofing itself and being perfectly content with doing so. I don't think anyone would deny Resident Evil's gameplay style, mechanics, and ever-raging dilemma of action and horror have transformed much more than the core elements of the narrative. Even in the boldest entries of the series, namely RE4 and RE7, the plot formula has just barely been tampered with. So how exactly do we itemize this Resident Evil plot formula, and just how closely did S.D. Perry adhere to these cherished traditions for her original narrative? Welcome everyone to the archetypal Resident Evil formula. It starts with a merciless passion for virology. No Resident Evil story could stand without someone's undying urges to manifest something truly remarkable. Marcus, Birkin, and numerous others, named or unnamed, trying their hand at doing God's work. And speaking of God, a mortal who seeks godhood, usually a scheming aristocrat, is the next crucial ingredient. Spencer, the Wesker children, Alexia Ashford, and even Mother Miranda are driven by their lust for the unimaginable, whether it be a cleansing of the human race through artificial selection, or by denying death his turn, renewing life through the perfect vessel. This antagonist may oversee that mad virologist, reaping the benefits of his lifelong endeavor, as seen in Spencer and Umbrella ripping away the works of Marcus and Birkin. Alternatively, the two villain archetypes can both exist in one body and one mind, as seen in the Wesker children and in Mother Miranda. The villains typically have very campy, tropey dialogue and absolutely love to play with their food, leaving themselves open to retaliation from the heroes. On the hero side, we have the competent rookie archetypes, as mentioned in the RE0 novel analysis. Rebecca and Leon are two exemplars of this, whereas Barry, Chris, and Jill all have some form of extensive training or prior experience. As established in the RE1 novel analysis, their distinct abilities make them uniquely useful. As Jun Takeuchi intended, our heroes typically face opposition from their corrupt superiors, knowingly or unknowingly, and are forced to scout the grounds of interest without their support. Then, we have the actual scenario routes that lead the heroes to the villains, to either battle them directly or simply retrieve evidence to expose their sins to the world. Along the way, the heroes progress through various puzzles, riddles, and ghastly bioweapons, typically grappling their way through a pretentious, labyrinth-like estate, a location isolated from the public eye. This complex structure is usually adorned by grandiose set pieces, sculptures, paintings, dining tables, and knight's armor, and is usually stalked by some hulking giant. Their search inevitably ends with a laboratory, providing insight into the ungodly practices at work. The final bioweapon, whether it be a horrid malformation of the virologists themselves or some other grisly being, is then decimated with a rocket launcher. Then, the large estate, whether it be a mansion, training facility, laboratory, or even an entire island or city, undergoes a total self-destruct sequence which our heroes evade by just a hair's breadth, somehow, every time. Traditionally by helicopter. And this formula encapsulates nearly 100% of the mainline RE narratives and many of the side games as well. Yes, there are slight tweaks and remixes to the science behind the madness, the various motives of the bioterrorists, and the roles of the heroes, but ultimately, this formula truly represents the essence of Resident Evil. So long as an RE narrative sufficiently covers this traditional checklist, it is destined to at least prolong the RE legacy, if not stand as a stellar entry on its own. The perfect storm of distinguishing attributes that make Resident Evil so easy to proliferate through any means, whether it be manga, games, mediocre action films, or even original novels. And as we dive into S.T.A.R.S. first original novel, watch as it fluidly incorporates all of the aforementioned elements into a single excursion. Keep in mind that this was written and published in 1998, long before the formula became the tradition that it is today. It's astonishing just how closely her tale resembles later RE titles, games that hadn't even been conceived yet. Pay attention to the bioweapons, villains, and their motives in particular, and I'm sure it'll ring some bells. Here it comes. It begins with the July 24th issue of the Raccoon Times, recapping the conflagration that consumed the Spencer estate. Umbrella assumes full responsibility for the incident and acts oblivious to the cause of the fire. 5 days later, the next issue announces that the Raccoon City S.T.A.R.S. has been officially discharged from investigating the case of the cannibal killers, the case that drives the first Resident Evil novel. The city council, police, and other officials are led to believe that the S.T.A.R.S. members had been operating while inebriated or high, causing the deaths of all but Chris, Rebecca, Barry, Jill, and Brad. In the final newsletter, Umbrella's Industrial Service Division finds no evidence of burnt persons in the raging inferno. When the council reprimands the S.T.A.R.S., Chief Irons simply nods his head, agreeing that disciplinary action may be appropriate. As mentioned earlier, this continues the corrupt superiors theme that we explored in both Resident Evil, the book, and the RE1 novel. The S.T.A.R.S. members find themselves pressured by multiple faces of authority who invalidate their accounts to hide Umbrella's secrets. In the previous entry, Albert Wesker was brutally eviscerated chasing promises of money, and now the mansion remained littered with the burnt corpses of S.T.A.R.S. members and the undead, but Umbrella's industrial division conveniently came up empty in their search. How unfortunate. Lastly, and most importantly, Chief Irons slanders the S.T.A.R.S. to shield his own reputation, lured by his own promises of money and his dream of becoming mayor. From a writing perspective, it's incredibly satisfying to see Irons, even more so as a secondary antagonist, steadily build momentum over the course of these first two novels and Resident Evil, the book. Irons is referenced multiple times in the first act of Caliban Cove as well, always a relevant obstacle. He continues to absorb our hero's hatred and frustration, only making us crave his cathartic fall even more. He's the greedy vulture that preys on Raccoon City, Umbrella's pet. And best of all is that we're multiple books in, and it isn't even his time yet. In the RE2 novel, City of the Dead, we can only imagine what'll become of him. We've made it past the prologue and into the first major act of this original tale, the S.T.A.R.S. briefing at Barry's. Rebecca bikes her way to his house, a concept we've only seen illustrated at the end of RE Revelations 2, when Barry returns with Moira and Natalia. But this is its own unique imagining of his home. It builds on the first novel's emphasis on Barry's presence as a loving father, his daughter's crayon drawings adorning the walls, and a familial warmth that greets Rebecca. As she enters the living room, we are introduced to the first original hero of the novel, David Trapp, a tall, handsome strategist of the S.T.A.R.S. Exeter branch in Maine. After introductions, Chris and Jill enter as well, and David shares the news that tormented him to no end. Just like Irons, just like Wesker, several S.T.A.R.S. members had been bought out by Umbrella. They'd spun new webs and gained new pawns, as if Raccoon City dangling from their puppet strings wasn't enough. David does his best to persuade Barry, Jill, and Chris to stay in Raccoon City and find the connection between Umbrella and the police. Meanwhile, David would recruit Rebecca to examine yet another Umbrella research facility in the secluded coastal town of Caliban Cove. He specifically took interest in her vast knowledge of virology and past experience with the T-virus, but had already rounded up a team of competent elites to infiltrate the grounds. For this reason, he doesn't see Barry, Jill, and Chris as crucial to the op. Though Chris flares up initially, he eventually sees David's logic. He's a shrewd, calculated figure that Barry, Jill, and Chris quickly learn to respect. David then provides maps, news articles, and codes for the team to examine, very similar to the codes handed to Jill in the first novel, and they are provided by the same enigmatic figure, Trent. After weighing their options for a few minutes, Umbrella troops start raining hell into Barry's home. Luckily, the five are able to escape via the window and gun down their pursuers, darting away from the house. They relocate to an unlikely safe haven, the home of Chickenheart Brad Vickers. Apparently, Brad had announced his leave of the city, but his lease hadn't ended yet, so Jill lockpicks her way into his place, and the other four follow. The stars have their final discussion and send off to Rebecca. Good wishes all around. It's amazing seeing how they individually respond to the suffocating circumstances around them. Chris is especially irritated at his lack of involvement, which is quite reminiscent of his behavior in the briefings in the RE1 novel and Resident Evil the book, but he does finally settle into his role, leaving the spotlight to Rebecca and the all-new team. A second sort of briefing scene occurs at the house of Karen Driver, one of the five on the Caliban Cove operation. This is where Rebecca and Steve, a handsome computer specialist and the best marksman of the five, have their first contact. The two have a seemingly mutual attraction to each other from the get-go, which becomes a more palpable chemistry later in the novel, but only slightly so. Any more desirable developments stay contained within the youngsters' fantasies, and perhaps those of the reader as well. If nothing else, these fleeting, flirty exchanges serve as their single solace in the dreadful reality of their mission. And for that, and a certain other reason, this subtle affection is very welcome. David then introduces Rebecca to John Andrews, the field scout. John's older age and muscular build remind her of Barry, but his most memorable characteristic is his humor, which ultimately defines him throughout the novel. No matter how grim the circumstance, his jokes are often dirty and immature, yet very fitting to his dynamic with the others, especially with Karen, whom he had worked with for years prior. His jesting with Steve reminded me of Brad, Barry, and Enrico teasing each other in the first novel, and this early dynamic urges the reader to develop a natural concern for these new S.T.A.R.S members, Steve, John, Karen, and the captain, David. They genuinely feel like RE protagonists in a side game, such as Revelations, if not a mainline entry. Quite a diverse cast, almost reminiscent of the side characters of Revelations 2 or the Outbreak games. And from this point forth, all the way until the final chapter, the happenings of this novel are best explained by the aforementioned Resident Evil formula. It should go without saying, considering how much I've let loose already, but be warned that the largest spoilers lie ahead, despite most of them being typical to an RE story. Our heroes venture forth into the cove via raft, encountering some bizarre ghostly bioweapons in the water, and other types on foot thereafter. They stumble across a labyrinth-like structure, of course, in the form of 5 major blocks, which they split up to examine. Their search is impeded by various riddles and puzzles, and an exceptionally intelligent new bioweapon, the Tri-Squad units, patrolling in groups of 3. Most of these creatures resemble horridly disfigured zombies, like those born of the T-virus, but these are adept enough to wield assault weapons and operate on their creators' instructions. As expected, the laboratory is the final obstacle, and so is the main villain. And my god, the dismal trek to the lighthouse, namely the final 100 or so pages, is one of the most bothersome segments in any Resident Evil narrative ever. I really didn't anticipate feeling so anxious during this final stretch. During one of the block explorations, John and Karen examine a contaminated room in which, unknown to them, the Tri-Squads were initially infected and thus created. The rest of the team is inundated with concern at the possibility of their infection and meets with them later. John and Karen are so quick to claim that they made no contact with anything in that room. Our heroes practically cheer with relief at the pleasant news, John joking about the very notion of them being quote-unquote stupid enough to stick themselves with needles in a place like this. And so the worry practically leaves the team, and this is where Perry hones her masterful craft of showing and not telling. In a sickening turn of events, Karen's right eye seems to have been exposed to the virus, decimating the premature celebration that just took place. It itches incessantly, and all the while, the descriptions try to undermine it as a slight irritation, a mere annoyance. The worst part of this sequence, that continues to fester for about 100 pages until the very end of the novel, is the tantalizing glimmer of hope offered by the team. After securing the 5 blocks, they make haste to find the labs to fetch an antidote for Karen, and she just keeps mutating and malforming, struggling to walk, to think, and even to speak. This plot device acts as a time bomb during the final act of the novel. It devastates John in particular. He absolutely annihilates the last of the Tri-Squad units in an apoplectic frenzy, screaming like a madman. He couldn't stand the deterioration, the dehumanization of his beloved Karen. And David's mind suffers horribly as well, his inner critique of himself bleeding out into his own words. The longer the novel goes on, the more David's character becomes a vessel for the reader's growing concerns. Much like the RE0 novel entertains Billy's perspective, David is given ample passages to develop his character. He bounces back from his own criticism at several points in the novel, but this far into the journey, he is the anguished leader, a man paralyzed from the inevitable hell raining on his team. Rebecca and Steve find that this new virus greatly enhanced the amplification process. While the T-virus took several days to fully consume a human host, this new strain could do so in mere hours, sometimes even less. Who developed this calamity? Who refined the work of Birkin and Marcus to this elite stage, to the point of producing commendable puppets rather than aimless, lost souls? This man's name is Nicholas Griffith. Earlier at Barry's, among Trent's hints was a list of names, one of which made Rebecca cower in fright. Nicholas Griffith, a man she knew to be a harbinger of hysteria, a gifted virologist rumored to use drug-induced behavior modification on his own pupils. In the mid-80s, 3 men were found infected with the fatal virus, Marburg, and perished, scarlet streams shooting out of their orifices. 3 assistants supposedly allowed a doctor to inject a cold virus into them, with the intent of curing it. That doctor was thought to be Griffith, and how appropriate it would be for him to harness his morbid talents with a corporation that craved them so gleefully. But make no mistake, this man's ambitions soared far higher than anything Umbrella could grasp. He did this not for the money, but to usher in a new age of humanity. Much like Albert, and much like Spencer, his motive was to cleanse the human race of the incompetent, insufferable beings that deserved no better. And thus, he is the archetypal Resident Evil villain in an original story, if there ever was one. Griffith has numerous exclusive chapters in the novel, leisurely sitting atop the lighthouse structure, awaiting the day of judgment, as RE villains tend to do. His own inner circle of 3 men, of the names Athens, Thurman, and Kinnison, are administered the Griffith virus, his panacea for the pitiful waste that was humanity. They retain their appearance and intelligence, fully capable of functioning as normal, speaking, and gesturing human beings. That is, with the instructions they required. These 3 were his personal puppets to command as he liked, as were the Tri-Squad units. And my God, what a sinister part his drones play in the final chapter. Towards the end of the novel, Steve himself is infected by Griffith's gift, turning into one of his servants. He shoots and kills a mutated, flesh-munching Karen and coerces John, David, and Rebecca into the underwater lab. Steve then fires at John, causing him to crumble, then forces David and Rebecca into an airlock and takes a final shot with his Beretta into his own skull. I never envisioned it would end this way, that it would leave me so low. All the while, Griffith marveling at his beloved children. No villain quite feasts on your heartstrings the way Griffith does. He feeds into your every concern for the heroes, toying with them so violently, yet so frivolously. These puppets and Griffith are very reminiscent of the Ganados and Sadler in RE4, respectively, and of the Magines and Albert Wesker in RE5. In essence, he developed the drone creation virus before any other could hope to fathom it, scoffing at Birkin's work as an unrefined prototype. Griffith all but claimed, "I'm not destroying the world, I'm saving it," before Wesker did. His canisters for disseminating the virus are also quite like Albert Wesker's in RE5. This is the gift he would grant to the world. And this, in essence, is Resident Evil. It's an undying vision for something beyond humankind, realized by those who vehemently pursue it, only barred by death. The rain is falling once again. Tonight, we examined another archetypal Resident Evil story, and a viciously entertaining one at that. Caliban Cove is proof that regardless of its ever-recurring elements, regardless of how tightly Resident Evil embraces its beloved formula, there are always compelling tales to be told. Perhaps Resident Evil need not rely on a grander, stranger approach with every new entry. Its core narrative formula is simply that alluring. It's the reason why revivals of our favorite stories often shine brighter than newer, more experimental ones. And there's a reason why this immortal formula continues to inspire additional lore and tales in every form imaginable. And speaking of additional lore, this family has some stories to tell. Be sure to tune into the Residents of Evil for a George Trevor Secret Files analysis. Sometime soon, we'll be diving into his scrapped RE1 game files, as well as his additional lore in the Sega Saturn bonus package. Thank you, everyone. My editor and I worked many hours, day and night, to produce this. I hope you enjoyed the phenomenal work he's done here. Special thanks to Dakota for the wonderful art. Special thanks as well to my supporters on Patreon: Mark 5, Andre Novoa, the one and only W, Tina, Katie Boone, Captain Redfield, Jareel Moon, Zachary Harp, Adriel, Everlasting Entertainment, John Griever, Micah Let's Play, John Wick, and Albert Chessa. Thank you for going above and beyond to support my content. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and check the YouTube community tab for updates. If you'd like a more centralized place for discussion on RE lore or otherwise, feel free to join the community Discord. I wish you and our special guest a good night full of rain and frights. I'll see you again, I'm sure. Perhaps just as George Trevor begins his work.